Move! They're firing! Watch out! This way! Keep moving! They're flanking us!
The moment the first red settled on his lapel, Ju Song's world narrowed to the frantic flicker of the girl's fingers. She signed shadows and above with a desperate, fluid speed that bypassed the roar of the city. To his lieutenant, the alley was a place of victory and profit, but to Ju Song, it had just become a kill box. He didn't wait for the click of safety or the intake of an assassin's breath. With a grace that contradicted his heavy burden, he reached out, snagging the back of his lieutenant's collar and hauling him behind a rusted industrial dumpster just as the first suppressed rounds hissed through the air. The sound of the money, thousands of dollars, exploding into the wind was like a flock of birds taking flight. Bills caught the neon light, glowing red and cyan as they swirled in the draft of the gunfire, creating a chaotic paper curtain. "Boss, what are you?" The lieutenant gasped, his eyes bulging as he watched a bullet spark against the metal where his head had been a second before. Ju Song didn't answer. His focus was fixed on the alcove. Through the cracked lenses of his glasses, he saw Kim Jae instinctively pull the girl into the hollow of a brick doorway. The blind man's face was a mask of serene terror. He couldn't see the danger, but he could hear the unnatural whistle of the subsonic rounds. He was shielding the child with his own body, his fingers still clutching the neck of his violin as if it were a lifeline. "Stay down," Ju Song commanded, his voice a low, vibrating blade. He didn't draw a gun. Instead, he gripped the violin bow he had retrieved from the pavement, a carbon fiber rod that felt more natural in his hand than any weapon. The gunman moved with professional silence. Two hooded figures dropping from the fire escapes like spiders. They were ghosts, part of the new breed of the syndicate that Ju Song himself had trained to be invisible. But they hadn't accounted for the girl. From her hiding spot, her small hands darted out again, invisible to the killers but clear as a beacon to Ju Song. Two, left, low. Using the swirling vortex of flying cash as a sensory screen, Ju Song moved. He was a conductor of the chaos, his acute hearing tracking the scrape of a boot on wet brick. He lunged, not toward the exit, but toward the family caught in the crossfire of the botch money drop. As a gunman leveled his weapon at the alcove to eliminate the witnesses, Ju Song intercepted him. The violin bow whipped through the air, catching the assassin in the throat with a precision that required no sight. In the sudden, heavy silence that followed, Ju Song stood over the fallen man, the rain washing the blood from his knuckles. He looked at the girl. Her hands were trembling now, tucked against her chest, but her eyes remained locked on his. For the first time in a decade, the ghost boss felt the heavy chain of his legacy begin to snap. He wasn't just a predator anymore. He was a shield. He realized then that these two weren't just bystanders. They were the only ones who truly saw him. He reached out a hand, his voice softening for the first time. "It's over. You're coming with me." The tires of the black sedan hissed against the wet asphalt as Ju Song guided the car through the labyrinthine backstreets of the city, eventually pulling into the underground garage of a nondescript, high-security villa. Inside the car, the silence was heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of the blind musician. Kim Jae sat in the back seat, his hands protective over the small girl, his sightless eyes darting toward every sound of the car's mechanical groans. When the engine cut, Ju Song turned in his seat. The interior light flickered on, illuminating the deep, jagged cracks in his sunglasses. "You are safe here," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the darkness. "No one in the syndicate knows this property exists." Kim Jae's head tilted, his heightened senses mapping the vast, empty space of the garage. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling like a frayed violin string. "Why would a man like you risk his life for a street performer and a child?" Ju Song didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted to the girl. She was staring at him with a startling intensity, her small face pale against the dark leather of his seats. She began to move her hands again, not with the frantic desperation of the alley, but with a sharp, rhythmic precision. The man with the neck tattoo, she signed, her fingers forming the symbols with an elegance that made Ju Song's throat tighten. He was the one. He signaled the shooters before the money fell. He looked at you like you were already a ghost. Kim Jae reached out, sensing the movement of her hands. Mina, stay still. Don't bother the gentleman, he murmured, unaware of the revelation unfolding in the silence. She is not bothering me, Ju Song said, his voice sounding distant, even to his own ears. He raised his hands into the light, his fingers stiff at first, then flowing into the shapes of a language he hadn't spoken in a decade. Are you sure it was the man with the tattoos? He signed back. Mina's eyes widened, her jaw dropping. She looked at his scarred, powerful hands, then back at his face. Yes, she signed, her movements growing more urgent. He dropped a coin. That was the signal. Kim Jae froze, his hand hovering in midair. You can understand her. I grew up in a house of silence, Jae, Ju Song replied, his eyes never leaving Mina. My sister taught me that the loudest secrets are the ones never spoken. He realized then that the betrayal went deeper than a simple ambush. His own lieutenant, the man who had stood at his shoulder for years, was the architect of the hit. Mina hadn't just warned him of the shooters. She had identified the rot at the heart of his empire. The ghost boss looked at the little girl and the blind man, and for the first time, he felt the true weight of his sunglasses. He wasn't just hiding his eyes anymore. He was hiding a man who was starting to care about the truth. She saw the face of the traitor, Ju Song said, turning to face the steering wheel, his expression hardening into a mask of cold resolve. And that makes her the most dangerous person in Seoul, which means I am the only one who can keep her alive. The safe house was a sanctuary of cold marble and high-tech silence, a fortress designed to keep the world out, yet it felt strangely hollow until the music began. Ju Song sat in a deep velvet armchair, his cracked sunglasses finally resting on the side table. For the first time in years, he allowed his eyes to close, though the darkness behind his lids was still haunted by the red laser sights of the alleyway. In the center of the room, Kim Jae stood with his violin tucked beneath his chin. He moved with a practiced, intuitive grace, feeling the air currents of the room to find his center. Mina sat cross-legged at his feet, her small hand resting on his shoe to feel the vibrations. As Jae drew the bow across the strings, a low, honeyed note bloomed in the air, filling the sterile space with a warmth that no heater could provide. The melody was ancient and mournful, a traditional Korean folk song woven with the grit of a man who had played on street corners for pennies. It wasn't perfect. There was a slight rasp where the wood was worn, but it was honest. Ju Song felt the music settle into his bones, acting like a solvent to the rigid tension that had defined his life since he took the throne of the syndicate. Every note seemed to peel away a layer of the ghost boss. He thought of the sister he had failed, the silent house of his youth, and the blood he had spilled to ensure he would never be a victim again. But as the violin climbed into a soaring, hopeful vibrato, the weight of the empire started to feel less like armor and more like a tomb. For the first time in a decade, the constant ringing of paranoia in his ears was silenced by the simple vibration of horsehair on gut string. Ju Song opened his eyes and looked at the duo. Mina was watching her father, her face glowing with a pride that was purely innocent. She caught Ju Song's gaze and didn't look away this time. She signed a single word, her hands moving slowly so he wouldn't miss it. Peace. Ju Song let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 10 years. The syndicate was hunting them. His lieutenant was a traitor, and the elders would soon realize he had vanished with the witnesses. His world was on fire. Yet, in this room, anchored by a blind man's song and a silent girl's grace, Hong Ju-song found something more dangerous to a mafia boss than any bullet. He found a reason to want to live, not just survive. The melody faded into a soft, lingering hum, leaving a silence that no longer felt empty, but full of a terrifying, beautiful possibility. The peace of the safe house was shattered not by a sound, but by the heavy, familiar vibration of a customized engine idling at the gate. Ju-song's ears, trained to distinguish the subtle mechanics of death, recognized it instantly. It was the predator's growl of a car belonging to Sang-cheol, his second-in-command, the man with the neck tattoos who had stood in the rain clutching bloody bills just 48 hours prior. Ju-song signaled for Jay and Mina to retreat into the inner sanctum of the villa. He waited in the dimly lit foyer, his cracked sunglasses back in place, the carbon fiber violin bow resting on the mantelpiece like a discarded weapon. When Sang-cheol entered, the scent of expensive cigarettes and cheap gunpowder followed him, a sharp intrusion into the scent of old wood and rosin. Sang-cheol didn't bow. He stood with his feet planted wide, his eyes scanning the opulent room with a predatory hunger. His gaze lingered on a small, colorful hair tied dropped near the rug, then shifted to the bow on the mantel. A slow, mocking smile tugged at his scarred lips. "The elders are asking questions, boss," Sang-cheol began, his voice a low rasp that filled the room like shifting gravel. "They want to know why the ghost of Seoul has gone silent. They want to know why you're hiding witnesses instead of burying them." Ju-song didn't move. "I'm the one who decides who lives in this city, Sang-cheol. Have you forgotten that?" Sang-cheol stepped closer, the neon-colored ink on his throat pulsing as he spoke. "I haven't forgotten, but the men are talking. They saw you in that alley. You didn't move like a boss. You moved like a father. You chose a blind beggar and a mute brat over the shipment." He spat on the polished floor. "This isn't the ghost I followed. This version of you is soft, fragile, like that glass over your eyes." The tension in the room was a physical weight, a thin wire pulled to the point of snapping. Ju-song could hear the erratic rhythm of Sang-cheol's heart, the telltale sign of a man preparing for a coup. The loyalty that had bound them for a decade was fraying, replaced by the scent of blood and opportunity. "You're blinded by that music, Ju-song," Sang-cheol sneered, his hand hovering near the holster at his hip. "The syndicate doesn't need a conductor. It needs a killer." "Then you should be very careful," Ju-song replied, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more threat than a shout. "Because a conductor knows exactly when the song ends." Sang-cheol stared at him for a long beat, the air thick with unspoken betrayal. Finally, he turned toward the door, but his parting glance at the stairs told Ju-song everything he needed to know. The shadow in the ranks had identified the target. The predator wasn't just at the gate anymore. He was inside the house, and he was hungry for the throne. After Sang-cheol's departure, the villa felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. Ju-song stood by the wide floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. To the world, he was the master of all he surveyed, but as he caught his reflection in the glass, suit sharp, expression frozen, eyes hidden, he realized he was nothing more than a ghost haunting a museum of his own making. This house was filled with Italian leather, bulletproof glass, and state-of-the-art surveillance, yet lacked the one thing that had resonated in Kim Jae's violin notes: life. He turned back to the room where Mina was sitting quietly by the fireplace, sketching patterns in the dust of a low table with her finger. She looked up as he approached, her eyes searching his face with that unnerving, silent intelligence. Ju-song knelt before her, his joints popping in the quiet room. He felt clumsy and oversized in this moment of vulnerability, a man built for destruction, trying to remember how to build. "Mina," he said softly, though he knew she was watching his lips. He raised his hands, the movement smoother now as the muscle memory of his childhood continued to thaw. He signed a word for safety, then followed it with a question. "Are you afraid?" Mina shook her head slowly. She reached out and touched the sleeve of his expensive wool jacket, then signed back. "This place is big, but it is cold." The honesty of a child struck him harder than Sang-Cheol's threats. Ju Song took a breath, his fingers tracing a new shape in the air. He brought his hands together, fingertips touching to form the shape of a roof, then pulled them inward toward his heart. "This is the sign for home," he showed her, repeating the motion with deliberate care. "It isn't about the walls or the locks. It is the place where you don't have to hide." Mina mirrored the gesture, her small hands forming the roof, her thumbs tucking toward her chest. She smiled, a tiny, radiant thing that made Ju Song's heart ache with a sudden, sharp clarity. He looked around at his home, the fortress of lies he had built to protect his power, and realized it was a hollow shell. He had spent 10 years perfecting the art of hiding, believing that survival was the same as living. But as Mina signed home back to him, her eyes bright with a newfound trust, Ju Song knew he couldn't stay in the shadows anymore. He couldn't keep her and Jay in a place built on blood and betrayal. If he wanted to give this girl a real home, he would have to tear down the empire that paid for the roof over their heads. He wasn't just a conductor anymore. He was a man beginning to understand that the most important lessons are the ones that require you to lose everything you thought you owned. Ju Song knew that staying in the villa was no longer an option. The fortress had become a lighthouse for his enemies, and with Sang-Cheol's suspicion reaching a boiling point, they needed to move under the cover of the city's pulse. He chose the Gwangjang night market, a place where the air was thick with the scent of bindiadik and the steam from 100-year-old stalls created a natural fog. Here, among the thousands of tourists and locals, a mafia boss, a blind violinist, and a silent girl could become ghosts. They moved through the narrow aisles, the neon signs overhead humming with a low-voltage buzz that vibrated in Ju Song's jaw. He kept his hand firmly on Kim Jae's shoulder, guiding him through the throngs of people, while Mina clutched the hem of Ju Song's coat. The sensory onslaught was overwhelming. The clatter of metal chopsticks, the shouting of vendors, and the searing heat of deep fryers. But Ju Song's ears remained tuned to the one sound that didn't belong, the rhythmic, heavy footfalls of men moving in formation. "Jay, don't stop walking," Ju Song whispered, his eyes scanning the crowd through his cracked lenses. Suddenly, Mina pulled hard on his sleeve. He looked down, and in the strobe-like flicker of a passing bicycle's light, her hands were moving with a violence that mimicked the chaos around them. "The man with the red hat," she signed, her fingers pointing toward a stall selling silk handbox. "And the one behind the steam. They have the long metal." Ju Song's blood turned to ice. Long metal meant silence barrels. He didn't look at the men. To acknowledge them was to invite the first shot. Instead, he pulled Jay and Mina into the narrow gap between a spicy rice cake stall and a clothing rack. "Where are the others?" Ju Song signed back, his movements tight and hidden by his body. Mina peered through the hanging fabrics. "Two more by the exit. They are waiting for us to run." She was seeing the world as a strategic map, her lack of voice replaced by an observational clarity that even Ju Song's veterans lacked. She signed a final, frantic instruction, the steam. "Now!" Just as the man in the red hat rounded the corner, Ju Song reached out and overturned a massive vat of boiling water onto a nearby grill. A massive, blinding plume of white steam erupted, hissing like 1,000 snakes. In the white-out confusion, Ju Song swept Mina into his arms and grabbed Jay's hand. They didn't run for the exit. Following Mina's earlier sign, they ducked into the basement of a seafood wholesaler, moving through the darkness as suppressed rounds thudded into the wooden stalls behind them. As they reached the safety of the delivery tunnels, Ju Song looked at the girl. She was pale, her chest heaving, but her eyes were steady. She had saved him again. He realized then that Sang-Chul hadn't just betrayed him. He had underestimated the power of those the world deemed broken. In the neon-soaked dark, the ghost boss realized his only hope for survival wasn't his gun. It was the girl who saw everything. The damp air of the delivery tunnels was replaced by the oppressive, clinical scent of incense and old paper as Ju Song stood in the center of the Inner Circle's council chamber. The syndicate elders sat in elevated, shadow-drenched chairs, their wrinkled faces as immobile as stone. To his left stood Sang-Chul, the neck tattoos on his jaw pulsing with a smug, quiet triumph. The betrayal was no longer a shadow. It was an open wound. "You have been absent, Ju Song," the eldest patriarch began, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering on a grave. The market was a disaster. Money lost, blood spilled in public, and rumors that the ghost of Seoul is sheltering the very eyes that saw our failure. Ju Song stood with his back straight, his hands clasped behind him. Even without his sunglasses, his eyes were unreadable, though the weight of the girl's trust felt like a physical warmth against his chest. "I am securing the witnesses to ensure the leak is cauterized," he replied, his voice a steady, dangerous silk. "Cauterized?" Sang-Chul sneered, stepping forward. "He's teaching the brat how to sign home. He's feeding them. He's listening to the blind man's music while our enemies laugh at our weakness." He turned to the elders. "He's compromised. He's choosing the garbage of the streets over the legacy of this family." The eldest raised a withered hand, silencing the room. The air grew cold, the silence heavy with the finality of a death sentence. "There's a simple solution, Ju Song. To prove your loyalty, to prove you are still the ghost, you will bring the blind musician and the child here. Tonight, you will handle the disposal yourself, and we will consider this lapse a moment of strategic curiosity. Do this, and the throne remains yours. Refuse, and you are no longer the boss. You are merely another body to be cleared from the alley." Ju Song's mind flashed to the safe house, to the way Mina had mirrored the sign for home, and the way Jay's violin had filled the hollow spaces of his soul. He looked at Sang-Chul, whose hand was already resting on the hilt of a blade, waiting for the order to execute. Ju Song's mind flashed to the safe house, to the way Mina had mirrored the sign for home, and the way Jay's violin had filled the hollow spaces of his soul. He looked at Sang-Chul, whose hand was already resting on the hilt of a blade, waiting for the order to execute. The throne was everything Ju Song had been built for. It was the only identity he had left. But as he looked at the elders, he realized they weren't kings. They were just more ghosts, trapped in a cycle of blood that never ended. The girl saw who pulled the trigger. Ju Song said, his voice dropping to a register that made the incense smoke tremble. "She saw the cowardice in this room before I did." He didn't wait for their reaction. He turned his back on the council, the ultimate gesture of defiance. "The throne is just a chair," he said over his shoulder. "But that girl is the only thing in this city that isn't a lie." As he walked toward the heavy oak doors, he heard the frantic click of weapons being readied. He had made his choice. He was no longer a king. He was a man with a target on his back, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt completely, terrifyingly free. The safe house was no longer safe, and the time for running had reached its crescendo. Ju Song led Jay and Mina into the grand, abandoned auditorium of the Seoul Arts Center, a place designed for acoustics, where even a sigh could travel to the furthest row. He ushered them into the heavy shadows of the orchestra pit. While he climbed onto the stage, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the high, arched windows. When the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall creaked open, Ju Song didn't need to see to know who had arrived. The synchronized, heavy thud of tactical boots against hardwood told him there were 6 of them. In the center was Sang-Chul, his erratic, shallow breathing betrayed by the cavernous space. Always the performer, Ju Song, Sang-Chul's voice boomed, mocking and hollow. You think a dark room and a violin bow will stop the elder's judgment. Ju Song reached out and shattered the main light panel with a single strike, plunging the auditorium into a total obsidian darkness. To the gunman, the world vanished. To Ju Song, the world became a symphony of movement. He heard the metallic slide of a safety being clicked off at 10 o'clock. He heard the rustle of a nylon jacket at 3 o'clock. In the dark, we are all equal. Ju Song's voice drifted through the air, impossible to pin down. But I've spent my life learning to listen to what the world tries to hide. The first gunman fired blindly, the muzzle flash a brief, violent spark. Ju Song was already gone. He moved like a shadow through the aisles, his feet light and silent. Using his carbon fiber bow, he struck with the precision of a metronome. A crack against a wrist, a sweep of a leg, a muffled grunt as a man collapsed. He wasn't killing, he was dismantling. From the pit, Mina watched the air, her eyes adjusting to the faint moonlight. She saw the silhouette of a final assassin flanking Ju Song from the balcony. Her hands moved in a frantic, silent blur. Hi, behind. Ju Song felt the displacement of air before the shot rang out. He rolled, the bullet splintering the stage floor where he had stood. He lunged into the seating area, his acute hearing locking onto Sang-Chul's panicked heartbeat. The traitor was firing wildly, the sparks illuminating his terrified face. Ju Song closed the distance in a heartbeat. He didn't use a gun. He used the bow, snapping it across Sang-Chul's throat and pinning him against a velvet-lined pillar. The ghost boss leaned in, his cracked sunglasses long gone, his eyes burning with a clarity that Sang-Chul had never seen. The song is over. Sang-Chul, Ju Song whispered into the darkness. Outside, the sirens began to wail, a dissonant finish to the night's performance. Ju Song stepped back, leaving the broken traitor for the authorities. He turned toward the orchestra pit, where the silent girl and the blind man waited. The symphony of violence was finished, leaving behind a silence that, for the first time, felt like a beginning. The golden glow of the grand concert hall was a world away from the rain-slicked neon alleys of Gangnam. Hong Ju Song sat in the center of the front row, his posture still straight and commanding, but the weight that once bowed his shoulders had vanished. He wore a simple, elegant suit without the shield of his cracked sunglasses. For the first time, his eyes were open to the light, clear and steady, no longer scanning for threats in the shadows. He wasn't watching for assassins. He was waiting for the music. A hush fell over the audience as Kim Jae stepped onto the stage. The blind musician moved with a new confidence, his cane replaced by the guiding memory of the floorboards he had walked 100 times during rehearsals. He reached the center of the stage and tucked a polished, deep cherry violin under his chin, a gift from Ju Song that carried a tone as rich as the life they had built together. As the first notes soared through the auditorium, Ju Song felt a familiar vibration in his chest, but it was no longer the hollow drumming of a man in a gilded cage. It was the resonance of peace. The melody was no longer a mournful street song. It was a complex, triumphant concerto that spoke of survival and second chances. Ju Song's gaze drifted to the wings of the stage. There, standing just behind the velvet curtain, was Mina. She looked vibrant in a dress the color of a morning sky, her eyes bright with a focus that rivaled Ju Song's own. As her father played, her hands began to move. She wasn't signing warnings of death or betrayal anymore. With fluid, poetic grace, she was translating the soul of the music into the air, her fingers dancing to the rhythm of the strings. She signed the words to the hidden lyrics within the melody, words of light, freedom, and family. When she reached the word for home, she made the sign Ju Song had taught her in the cold silence of the villa, touching her fingertips together like a roof and pulling them toward her heart. She looked directly at him, a small, knowing smile breaking across her face. Ju Song felt a warmth overflow within him, a sensation far more powerful than the fear he had once commanded as the ghost boss. He had dismantled an empire and walked away from a throne of blood, trading a crown of shadows for a seat in the light. The syndicate was a fading ghost of its own, and the academy he had founded for children like Mina had become his new legacy. As the final note of the violin faded into a lingering, beautiful silence, the auditorium erupted into thunderous applause. Ju's song stood, his hands coming together not to strike, but to celebrate. He looked at the blind man bowing on stage and the silent girl waving from the wings, and he knew that his story was no longer being written in the dark. The final bow had been taken, and for the first time in his life, Hong Ju Song was exactly where he was meant to be. He was home.